Tonight, our topic, as all of you know, is Ukraine, Syria, and the downfall in U.S.-Russia relations. And our guest, Professor Goldgeier, is a native of Baltimore. He went to the Gilman School. Many of you know his mother, who taught for years at the Roland Park Country School. And he was good enough to join us 10 years ago to talk about U.S.-Russia relations. And I happened to notice that he also wrote an article at that time, or gave an address on getting along with Putin. And the subject hasn't changed a lot in a sense. But in any case, this is one of the important of U.S. relations, of course, but not just to us, to the stability of Europe, and as we're turning out to the near abroad and even into the Middle East. Certainly the impact of Russian foreign policy is huge today. We're delighted that he's going to address it. He has written on Europe, he's written on NATO. The question of NATO's expansion being essentially inevitable was a theme of one of his books. And he's talked about Russian foreign policy, at least emphasizing Stalin to Gorbachev. And he has also, of course, written about U.S.-Russia relationships, most obviously since the Cold War. So his academic work is focused very clearly and directly on the subject matter tonight. His career path has been interesting. He's been associated with the major institutions that deal with international affairs in the United States, and the Library of Congress, the Brookings Institution, Council on Foreign Relations, among others. And of course, he's taught at Cornell for a period of time. He was at George Washington University through several periods, emphasizing and being in charge of their institute on Russian Eurasian affairs. He also had a short tenure with the State Department and also with the National Security Council. So he's seen these problems from several vantage points. He today is part of a group that is trying to emphasize the importance of linking scholarship to practical problems, a major effort. And he serves as president of the Association of Schools that Teach International Affairs. In short, he's had a marvelous 30-year career in which he's associated with and dealt with the best institutions in the country, and has worked seriously to try to understand these enormous problems which confront the United States and do to a great extent center about U.S.-Russia relations. It's an enormous pleasure to present to you Mr. Professor James Goldgeier.
Thank you, Frank. That's so kind. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here this evening. I was wondering on my drive up what the weather might do, but it obviously, as Frank said, there's no softness in Baltimoreans. So, and of course, for me, it's always great to be back in Baltimore. And I would encourage you. I didn't realize Ambassador Speckert was coming next month, so you'll have to give him my regards. I worked with him at the State Department 20 years ago, so he's had a very distinguished career. And I also just want to acknowledge Frank's tremendous leadership of this council. It's really quite remarkable. And my mother wanted to be sure that I passed along my regards, so. U.S.-Russian relations. I want to remind you how hopeful many of us were a quarter century ago. Between 1989 and 1991, something I do have to remind my students because they weren't alive, but I'll just mention to you, I know you remember. First, we had the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, leave the Soviet orbit. And then, miraculously, the Soviet Union itself fell apart. And it's important to remember that while we viewed the collapse of the USSR as our victory, many Russians, and especially Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, viewed that as their victory. As president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin had defeated Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev for supremacy in that sphere and had emerged as the leader of an independent Russia. He supported the independence of fellow Soviet republics, including Ukraine, which voted for independence on December 1st, 1991, a vote in which all regions, including Crimea, voted in favor of independence. Yeltsin, as president, played a critical role in supporting the removal of nuclear weapons from Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, which was a major policy objective of the United States, and in fact, in that process, in 1994, signed a document with the leaders of the United States, United Kingdom, and Ukraine, guaranteeing Ukraine's security in exchange for the removal of nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons from Ukraine. Yeltsin, in addition, ensured the removal of Soviet troops from the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and took other steps to support free and independent countries emerging from the Soviet Union. And while there were frictions in the 1990s in the United States-Russian relationship, the combination of the extraordinary American dominance of the world system in the 1990s, as well as Yeltsin's pursuit of integration into Western institutions, helped diminish those frictions. The U.S. policy toward Europe and the former Soviet Union had been enunciated by George H.W. Bush in May of 1989 and has been promoted by every president since then, and that was to foster a Europe whole and free, and what eventually became a policy to foster a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And the basic premise behind the policy was pretty simple, was the notion that World War I, World War II, and the Cold War had all, at least in the European theater, had all emerged due to conflicts and tensions in the heart of Europe. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, now was the opportunity to overcome those old divisions and build a unified and peaceful Europe. The key elements of that policy, as it played out over the 1990s, were the enlargement of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, into Central and Eastern Europe, the enlargement of the European Union into Central and Eastern Europe, and the effort to foster a new relationship with Russia. To a great extent, and at least for some period of time, this was perhaps the most successful U.S. policy of the post-Cold War period, and one could argue among the policies of the United States in the post-World War II period, among the most successful. Former communist countries across Europe joined both NATO and the European Union and became democratic, market-oriented, and promoted the rule of law and the protection of human rights. The challenge, I think, derived largely from the changes that occurred within Russia itself and the transition from Boris Yeltsin to President Putin, but I'm more than happy to talk about the issues that were created by the United States and its Western partners. I say that the transition from Yeltsin to Putin because Putin then and now saw the 1990s as a disaster for Russia, as a period in which Russia lost its status as a great power, in which Russia suffered through an enormous economic contraction, and in which there was, in Putin's mind, chaos and disarray in Russia that he, as president, was determined to address. His goal was to bring Russia back as a great power in world politics. He also sought to control the domestic political sphere within Russia, and he will, barring any unforeseen circumstances between now and his next election, will have essentially run Russia from 2000 to 2024. Only interrupted as president during the period when Dmitry Medvedev was president and he served as prime minister, but I don't think anyone was under any illusion that he was in charge even during that period, a point that I will come back to at the end because it is the only hopeful point I can raise during this discussion. So the United States comes out of the Cold War with the goal of fostering a democratic, market-oriented Europe that would include Russia, and that I know is a point that many would debate. But the United States also did this as clearly the dominant actor in the European security sphere. And we have had in President Putin a president whose goal has been to limit U.S. influence in Eastern Europe, and again, to rebuild the sense of Russian greatness. With respect to the policy that the United States pursued in this period, NATO enlargement, most importantly, but also as an ally of the Europeans, European Union enlargement as well, the clear red line for Putin was the potential inclusion of the non-Baltic nations of the former Soviet Union. So taking out Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are members of the European Union and NATO, Putin made clear that he would not tolerate the inclusion of any of the other former Soviet republics in NATO or the European Union. He believed the United States sought to foster regime change in these countries. For example, in Ukraine, in the Orange Revolution of a decade ago, and then more recently in the events in 2013, 2014. And he has believed that the United States' goal is to foster regime change in Russia itself. He has sought to ensure that Russia controlled the affairs of what he considers to be his sphere of influence, regardless of the principle that these countries should be able to choose their own futures as enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act, signed by all European nations, including Russia, in 1975. We saw this first in Georgia in 2008, when Putin, concerned about the possibility of NATO membership for Georgia, went to war with that country. And of course, he escalated even further in the spring of 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the support for Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, in order to prevent Ukraine from moving closer to the West. The United States, in response, has largely chosen defensive measures. It's been reactive, designed to impose some costs on Putin for the actions in Ukraine, but the goal from the United States perspective has largely been to contain the conflict in Ukraine to Ukraine. Whether Ukraine ultimately emerges as a sovereign country free to pursue its own future, whatever the rhetoric of the Obama administration, is not a high priority, given all the other things that are going on in the world. And that's in part because of Ukraine's own course since that independence vote in December of 1991. It is a country that has squandered enormous amounts of Western assistance provided to it in that period, and did very little until very recently to even try to combat the corruption that was endemic in the political system in Ukraine. And of course, also because the Obama administration does not want a war with Russia, understandably. So the policy the United States has pursued with respect to Ukraine has had three essential elements, as the administration does hope to see full implementation of the ceasefire in Ukraine and some kind of agreement on how Ukraine can move forward, given the differences between the government in Kiev and the separatists in eastern Ukraine. First were the sanctions. The Obama administration, with its European allies, in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea, leveled significant sanctions on individuals close to Putin, as well then on several key Russian companies. And the goal of those sanctions, by targeting individuals close to Putin, was to, and it was a vain hope, it was hoping that those individuals feeling pain, individuals who were living large prior to the imposition of those sanctions, would go to their boss and say, come on, you got to do something different here because you're killing us. Well, the problem was he was able to take care of those individuals, and also their loyalty to him was over and above anything that the Obama administration could address. So I don't think that the sanctions were ever really going to, in and of themselves, make a difference with respect to Putin's calculations. But I would say from a Western perspective, it's been very impressive to see the kind of unity that has existed in the West with respect to those sanctions, and particularly the willingness of German Chancellor Angela Merkel to impose significant sanctions in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea, because she does lead a country with significant business ties. The German-Russian business communities are extremely close, and she faced a lot of pressure to not go along with the sanctions, but her response was that this was necessary given what the Russians had done in Ukraine. Now, it's important to realize that the sanctions policy has been limited, largely because of the need to try to keep everyone on board. In the initial aftermath of the annexation and then the heating up of the conflict between the separatists that were supported by Russia and the Ukrainian government, there was the promise by President Obama that if President Putin escalated, that the United States would ratchet up the sanctions. And that did not occur, certainly after about 6 months into the crisis. Second element was to reassure NATO members that they will be defended if necessary. And it is important to distinguish between NATO members, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine. Through the NATO treaty, those NATO members do have a security guarantee. And if that security guarantee was not upheld, this would be an enormous blow to the North Atlantic Alliance. And so the Obama administration and its European allies, recognizing this, have sought to take steps to reassure those countries that if Putin or the Russian government were to do anything to undermine their security, that the NATO allies would be there with them. And we've seen, in terms of President Putin's behavior, that he recognizes the difference between a non-NATO member and a NATO member. What he did in Ukraine, he certainly hasn't sought to repeat in a NATO member. He did with his rhetoric in the spring of 2014 when he talked about the need to protect Russian speakers who, as he put it, just happened one day to find themselves waking up outside of the country they thought they were living in. He argued that this was something that was important as a Russian president, that he should assure them that he would look out for them and protect them. And of course, a country like Estonia with a significant Russian population was extremely nervous about these statements from President Putin. And that's why that reassurance was necessary. But again, he seems to have recognized that things that he can do in Ukraine, he really can't do in Estonia. I think actually, as an aside, that this is quite fortunate for NATO, because I do wonder what would happen if, in fact, he took an action in Estonia that would require a NATO response. How seriously would all the members of NATO feel they needed to be to defend Estonia? I think the United States would feel strongly that it needed to be done, but if you look at the polling data throughout Europe, certainly well below 50% of the populations in many of the West and Southern European countries show no support no real support for stepping up to secure a country like Estonia. But NATO has done many things. It's stepped up its air and sea patrols, both Baltic Sea and Black Sea patrols. It has developed a flexible force that can be moved into the eastern members of NATO, the territory of the eastern members, if necessary, a force that can be rotated through. There have been some new headquarters set up. But even here, just as the sanctions were limited, so has this policy on really shoring up the defense of these countries. There's been the effort to increase the patrols, doing more exercises, but there has been a reluctance to move much infrastructure into those countries in order to really send a signal that they would be defended. And that's largely because different countries have different interpretations of how seriously to take the 1997 accord that was signed between the NATO countries and Russia, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which promised at that time that NATO would not take steps to move infrastructure into those new members because at the time it was said it had no need, no intention, no plan to do this. But the difference now is those countries that feel that because of Russia's behavior that there's no need to follow what the Founding Act had, the terms that had been agreed to in the Founding Act, other countries feeling that it's still important for their relationship with Russia to try to uphold those provisions. So sanctions, but limited. Reassurance of the eastern members, but limited. And then finally, supplying Ukraine with assistance, but limited. And limited to non-lethal military aid and some training. There have been many individuals outside the Obama administration, and as far as we can tell, individuals inside the Obama administration that have called for the provision of lethal military aid to the Ukrainian government in order to try to increase its ability to defend itself against the separatists who are supplied by the Russians. But Obama has not followed that advice and has sought to keep the assistance limited, again, because he does not want to see the conflict escalate. Now, of course, if it weren't enough that we had this conflict in Ukraine and the moves in 2014 and then the reactions to that move, we now have the more recent Russian move into Syria and a quite stepped up effort to attack various targets in Syria. Initially, this was a move that was described as the need to combat ISIS, but after the initial Russian actions, which were not taken against ISIS, but in fact against opposition groups, some of which the United States was supporting, who were opposed to the regime of Bashar al-Assad, it became quite obvious what the purpose of this intervention was, and that was to shore up that regime. Now, the United States has had no real policy towards Syria over the last 4+ years other than to stay out. And I think that this reflects how President Obama saw himself as he came into office and what he was elected to do. In his view, he inherited 2 wars, and he was elected to get the United States out of those 2 wars, and he was not elected to get the United States into new ones. And certainly, it initially looked like he might accomplish that objective. It looked like the United States had, in fact, gotten out of Iraq, and it looked like the United States would remove all of its troops from Afghanistan by January 2017, when President Obama leaves office. Of course, with Iraq, the United States has gone back in, even in a more limited way, to combat ISIS. And the president has now decided to leave a residual force in Afghanistan after he leaves office, in large part because of what occurred in Iraq after the United States troops left. And the idea being that the United States should keep troops in Afghanistan in order to try to prevent a situation like the one that has occurred in Iraq. The United States is more actively involved in Syria than it was before. The president has ordered special operations forces to go into Syria to assist those groups opposed to the Assad regime, and that's in conjunction with the diplomatic initiative that is now ongoing with the external powers with an interest in the conflict. Unfortunately, that's not going to be enough if the internal parties are not part of any kind of agreement, but at least there has been movement toward bringing together those countries outside of the conflict, the United States, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, to try to come together to see about negotiating a solution. We know, or at least we think we know, what President Putin wants in Syria, and that is to maintain the Russian sphere of influence there. There are not a lot of places where Russia has an influence, so to maintain that. And whether or not Syria holds together, I think, is not something that President Putin believes is an important question. His main goal is to make sure that he is assisting with the control of a particular part of Syria, and that is the part that's controlled by the Assad regime. And so it's not that dissimilar from Ukraine, where he's controlling a part of the territory. He's kept the naval base that was of such great concern to him and was in part the rationale for the annexation of Crimea, and he'll be able to maintain the base in Syria as well. So what do we want? I think largely what we want is also similar to what we want in Ukraine. We want a conflict that can be contained to Syria. The problem is this really requires an end to the war in Syria because, as we have seen, the result of the Syrian war is this incredible movement of refugees out of Syria to the west. I think the Russian move into Syria has implications for the conflict in Ukraine. On the one hand, you have Russians moving, the Russian government has moved some of its forces out of Ukraine to Syria. But I think also the Russian move into Syria exacerbates the refugee crisis into Europe rather than diminishing it. And I think Putin may believe that he can get the Europeans to really want to solve the Ukrainian crisis on his terms because they're so overwhelmed by the refugee crisis from the Middle East. So what are the implications of all that has taken place since 2014? I think the United States has in fact signaled, and it really probably signaled this at some point before that there are limits to the policy to foster a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Most of Europe has been included in that endeavor and included in NATO and the European Union, and NATO will soon have its newest member, mighty Montenegro, will be joining the alliance, and that's probably about it for some time, unless Macedonia and Greece can work out the issues related to the name of the country of Macedonia. But I think that what we've seen both in 2008 and 2014, the first in Georgia and then in Ukraine, is that the policy always had its limits, and that is that it really never addressed the security of the countries in between NATO, EU, Europe, and Russia. And so we really failed to address the insecurity, and not just we, but the United States and its European allies, to address the insecurity of countries like Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. The United States, of course, also in recent years has signaled that there are limits to its involvement in the Middle East and was largely looking to get out as much as possible rather than to be stuck in further conflicts in the Middle East. Russia, meanwhile, has made clear, certainly under President Putin, that it views the insecurity of its neighbors as vital to its security, and that's how it's treated Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. Is this really helpful to Russia over the long term? Russia is draining resources to support the separatist groups in Ukraine. The government in Kiev in Ukraine is even more eager to draw closer to the West. Putin's visions of creating a Eurasian Union that would include the former Soviet republics cannot succeed without Ukraine, and so that vision is gone. Who are Russia's friends in the world? President Assad? Some revolutionary guards in Iran, maybe? Separatists in eastern Ukraine? I do have to respond. I heard a whisper of China, okay? Nothing could be further from the truth. Chinese view on Russia is one of total contempt. Total contempt. And they are going to use Russia to ensure energy supplies as part of its broader global agenda of ensuring energy supplies for the Chinese economy. But they strongly believe they have the upper hand in any relations that they have with the Russians. I think the Russian moves into both Ukraine and Syria are part of a broader pattern, which is to push back against this idea of U.S. hegemony in the world, and particularly U.S. dominance of Europe and the Middle East. To create a sense of Russia, again, as a great power, and to solidify Putin's standing at home. In terms of how to move forward, I find it very difficult to see how United States-Russian relations are going to improve as long as Putin is president of Russia. I've become very disturbed, I guess is the word. I don't know. I'm very unhappy with how personal the relationship between the two leaders has become. We've had good relationships at times, and we've had bad relationships at times. I've been asking people whether they remember a time when the way in which the two leaders talked about each other was so derisive, where they openly mock one another. Khrushchev had his crazy statements, but I really am. I'm really struck by it, and I really, if anybody in this administration were to ask me for my advice, I would say, you know what? Whatever Putin says, just ignore it. You don't have to do the same. The president doesn't have to go on 60 Minutes and make cutting comments about Putin and his leadership. The United States is hoping to raise costs to Putin. They've hoped in Ukraine, through the sanctions and other policies, to try to raise costs to him. They're hoping now by supporting opposition forces in Syria that they can raise the cost of his military adventure there, and that he'll change his behavior, that Russia will change its behavior, basically reminiscent of the containment policy of the Cold War. But Putin has shown almost no inclination to change his policy. It's hard to accommodate somebody like Putin because you don't want Putin to view you as weak. And so it makes it very difficult to find accommodation. And so I do think that the United States policy is going to continue to be and should be keeping up the pressure on Putin while we shore up our own allies and try to limit the damage that Russia is causing. The only real hope, in my view, for a real difference in relationship would be a real collapse in global world oil prices. If you look at the relationship between Russia and the United States over the last 40 years, Soviet Union and Russia with the United States over the last 40 years, and plot it against the price of oil, it's when oil prices are high, the relationship is more conflictual. And when oil prices are low, the relationship is much more collaborative. In 1998, poor Boris Yeltsin, oil prices were $11 a barrel. There weren't a lot of adventures he could embark on at $11 a barrel. Putin became president. For most of his presidency, he's been blessed with high oil prices and the ability to use those oil prices to cushion himself against all sorts of things domestically and to be able to act internationally. That would be much less true but oil prices would really have to come down even further from where they are today. Will the United States presidential election change anything? Well, Donald Trump has promised that he can sit down with President Putin and fix everything. And I'm not sure whether we'll find that out or not. I said to my students recently, you know, the problem for a social scientist is you don't get to run different experiments. So you don't get to have a President Trump experiment and see whether or not what he said would happen. If we're looking at a President Hillary Clinton or we're looking at a President Marco Rubio, I would expect actually only tougher rhetoric and a tougher approach, certainly on Ukraine, than we have seen under President Obama. And so I fear that as bad as the relationship is, it hasn't been this bad since the early Reagan years, and it's likely to get worse. And that's where I was going to end this talk, but I thought, oh my gosh, you know, you're going to be back in Baltimore, you can't do that. So you have to come up with something optimistic. All right, so here's my one optimistic bone that I'm throwing. And that is to remember what occurred during the first Obama term, when we had the reset. Remember, President Obama came in, the relationship with Russia was terrible toward the end of the Bush presidency. And Obama came in and promised a reset. And yes, it was Dmitry Medvedev who was the president of Russia, but Prime Minister Putin was in charge of the country. There's nothing that Medvedev could have done that Putin disagreed with. And the reset in that first term, while it is much derided today, was incredibly successful. The two countries agreed on increased sanctions on Iran. Russia agreed to provide transit for American personnel and material into Afghanistan. Critical. I don't think people really recognize that that mission to go into Pakistan to assassinate Osama bin Laden, I don't believe it could have been done. I doubt President Obama believes it could have been done without that path that the Russians had agreed to into Afghanistan. Because if the only way in was through Pakistan and the danger of what would happen to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, I don't think President Obama could have made that decision. So it was crucially important that we'd had that. And the New START Treaty. You know, any movement toward reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons is a positive. So we had that in the first term. It was possible to do business between the two countries during President Obama's first term. And I'll add to that sense of optimism that I decided I would have to bring to Baltimore. Yesterday's meeting between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Two individuals who haven't had the greatest relationship, and yet recognize the need to sit down and discuss the important business between the United States and Israel. An effort to focus on substance and not personality. And I think that we know the one issue on which, at least theoretically, there's a common interest. I say theoretically because there are lots of caveats with respect to the role that terrorism and the threat of non-state actors can play in bringing countries together. Countries have different definitions of what terrorism is. They have different definitions of how best to respond to that terrorism. But all countries have an interest in defeating, or at least diminishing, the threat posed by non-state terrorist actors. Whatever's going on in Syria, the United States and Russia do have a common interest in combating ISIS. The United States and countries around the world have an interest in combating the influence of a group like Al-Qaeda. And so there is a common interest, at least there, and one that perhaps can be built upon as we try to think about how to bring the United States-Russia relationship back from the low point that it's at today. So there's my optimistic note to close on, and I look forward to any comments or questions that you might have. Thank you.
Well, we certainly thank you for a marvelous overview, very dense. I'm going to ask you, when you call upon people, to repeat the question, if you would, for our camera.
Sure. Yes, ma'am, please. So the question was about the younger generation in Russia, and as they move more into leadership positions, what will that mean for the relationship between the West and Russia, the United States and Russia? So this was an important part of the premise in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. This sense that the older generation that had grown up in the Soviet Union, that had been used to, had lived through the communist system, that had been used to this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, would gradually give way to a new generation for whom the Cold War was a distant memory, the communist system was a distant memory. This generation would be benefiting from the openness in the economy, certainly in the 1990s, the openness in the political system. And it really hasn't played out the way many people expected. And I would say there are a couple reasons for that. One is the tremendous dominance of the information sphere in Russia that the Russian government is able to, that the Russian government possesses. Their ability to present information about what's going on in the world, and things like the shoot down of the or the potential. I hesitate on this plane over the Sinai because we don't have, as far as I know, we don't have evidence one way or the other on that. But clearly, you have enough people in the West talking about the potential that there was a bomb on board that plane, and there's an alternative theory building in the Russian media regarding that this was a United States shoot down of the plane. So we've seen this repeatedly in recent years. I think you also have, and it's been stoked by Putin. I think you have a serious nationalist sentiment in Russia that the United States, being the dominant power in global affairs since the end of the Cold War, has not treated Russia well, that has sought to keep Russia down. And there is I think there's significant, it's not anti-American sentiment, and there's always been good relationships and interactions between Americans and Russians, just as there have been between Americans and Iranians. But it's a feeling toward the United States government that the United States government is seeking to reduce, and has been seeking since the end of the Cold War, to reduce Russia's influence in the world. And I think that has a pernicious effect on the way in which even younger people in Russia view the United States and its role. Yes. So the question was, will something like what happened on the airplane, and won't be the last thing that occurs, will that help foster collaboration between the United States and Russia? That's why I ended as I did, because I really do believe all countries in the world, any kind of sovereign government, has to want to collaborate with other governments in order to mitigate the threat that these non-state terrorist groups are causing throughout the Middle East and also beyond. I mean, it's a concern to China, it's a concern to India, it's a concern to everybody. The problem is, the challenge is, we define these threats differently. I mean, as your question alluded to, the question over there, Putin's looking at this through the lens of what's going on in southern Russia and Chechnya, and trying to eliminate Dagestan, other places, eliminate the threats there and keep those threats from coming up through Russia's south. And he has defined the problem in ways and defined groups as terrorist groups that we haven't done. And so we have a difference there. We have differences with the way in which the Indian government views the terrorist issue, which is wrapped up in their relationship with Pakistan. So we have differences, of course, with how Saudi Arabia views the terrorist issue. And Saudi Arabia, which has lost interest in the Syrian conflict and is focusing its attention on Yemen. So the problem is all these countries have very different primary interests as they deal with these challenges, but they all have a common interest in wanting to see a reduction of influence of non-state terrorist groups that threaten sovereign regimes. I mean, that's something that they should all be able to want to work together to try to address. So the questions are NATO's move across Europe. Was there ever any discussion about Russia potentially becoming a part of NATO? And then the question of what about Putin's need to build domestically, build the infrastructure in Russia and to try to strengthen the Russian economy? And how does that factor into the equation? On the NATO issue, so the 1949 treaty that established what became the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that Washington Treaty, signed in April of 1949, has an Article 10, that says that NATO can invite any European state to join, essentially as long as that country meets the criteria of being a member and can contribute to alliance security. And Russia is a European state. And it's really known as the open door policy. It's one of the reasons why the United States and some of its West European allies have been so reluctant to slam the door on a country like Ukraine, because of that Article 10, that we are committed to an open door, and that countries, even if Ukraine or Georgia is not going to become a member of NATO for 10 or 20 years or more, that theoretically they should be able to have the opportunity to join just as Poland did, just as Spain did in 1982, just as Greece and Turkey did in 1955, just as the newer members have, that Ukraine should have that same opportunity. And theoretically, because Russia is a European state, Russia should have that opportunity as well. Now, it hasn't really been tested. It has been discussed at various times. It was discussed a lot in the mid-1990s. There was an effort to try to, by President Clinton, to try to say to Boris Yeltsin that this is an open door and that means the door is open to Russia as well. Yeltsin never really bought it. And I think folks in the Pentagon were probably freaking out about these comments about Russia potentially becoming a member of NATO. There was one moment, I think it was 1997 or 1998, when Vice President Al Gore was meeting with Yeltsin, and he made this comment about Russia could be a member of NATO someday, and Yeltsin said to him, Russia is very, very big, and NATO is very, very small. So I don't think he bought it. Putin, when he first came in, was making noises about the possibility of NATO membership. And I think, the challenge has always been, and it goes back even to before the end of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev used to talk about a common European home. The vision on the Russian side was always that if there was going to be some kind of European security framework, that Russia would be seen as an equal to the United States in determining the future of that common European home. And the United States' vision coming out of the Cold War was, well, we're the main power and NATO is the main organization, and we're going to try to ensure that we remain in charge of European security. And Russia really, it was very apparent to the Russians that if they were to be part of anything, it would clearly be as a junior partner, and that wasn't really particularly attractive. So, and I think the United States and its West European partners did not really understand how neuralgic it was for many Russians that NATO, its Cold War adversary, would not only continue but would expand. And the comments usually from the United States officials in meeting with Russian officials was always, you know, NATO's not a threat to you, NATO's not going to attack you. And I think one of the problems that we've often faced with respect to the Russians, and we do this with other countries as well, we like to tell them what their interests are and why they shouldn't be upset. And, you know, all you can do is just describe what you believe your own interests are. You can't really tell others what their interests are. With respect to what's occurred domestically, I mean, Putin, again, because of most of his time as leader, he's been blessed with high oil prices. He really hasn't had to do the kinds of things that would put the Russian economy on a firmer footing, that would really address the Russian infrastructure. It's one of the problems that exists because of the failure to tend to the infrastructure for extracting oil and gas. The Russian ability to continue to produce as much oil and gas has declined, and that's one of the reasons why we see the Russians moving into new areas like the Arctic, where they hope to increase their access to oil and gas. But I think that it's the domestic economy has suffered throughout the period since the end of the Soviet Union. There's still, of course, tremendous corruption within Russia. The climate for Western business in Russia is not what it was in the 1990s, so I think there have been a huge number of missed opportunities there. The first one was really not a question. It was just, I think there was no question there, but it was mainly a comment that Putin's bringing back the spy movie genre, and Bridge of Spies, I thought was an excellent movie. But and then there's this question about how we think about issues with respect to self-determination. That in the end of the Cold War, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, we looked at all these countries emerging, as I started with. Ukraine declared its independence on December 1st, 1991. It followed the earlier declarations of independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But there has been a limit to the independence declarations. There are regions within particular countries, Nagorno-Karabakh and the Caucasus, Chechnya, within Russia itself, where we have not approached things, the issue of self-determination, in the same way. We've seen this throughout Europe. We saw this with the reaction to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and initially really a great reluctance on the part of the United States to support the breakup of the then Yugoslavia, and then even further into further constituent parts. Of course, the United States and its allies went to war in 1999 over Kosovo, which then became independent and has been recognized by most countries as independent. The challenge whenever you sort of deal with the issue of self-determination is that we talk about it as a principle that's important, that we uphold, but only really when it's politically convenient for us to do so. And when it's politically inconvenient, we try to find ways to limit that drive for self-determination. We don't want Quebec to secede from Canada. We don't want Scotland to secede from the United Kingdom. It would be a disaster. Yeah, they did, but they're going to have another. But with Scotland, if the United Kingdom decides to leave the European Union, you will have the Scottish referendum. It will be back on the table, and I think most people believe that the Scots would want to leave the United Kingdom and join the European Union. If the United Kingdom were to leave the European Union. So we face this issue in the Middle East today with respect to the Kurds. The Kurds are our closest allies in the conflict in Iraq, But we have not promoted an independent Kurdistan. And that's largely because the Kurds are not only in Iraq, but also in Turkey and Syria. And, for a long time, the issue of self-determination was also an issue with respect to how the United States viewed the Palestinians. And although the United States now supports a two-state solution, that was not always the case. So these are, whatever the principle is underpinning our views of the proper way that things should be in the international system. Politics always plays a role, and certainly when there was talk about Texas seceding from the Union, most people anyway thought that would be bad for the United States, and certainly the United States government would not be in favor of that secession. I hear a number of remarks under your breath, but so I'm not gonna comment further. Right, so technology, issues related to cybersecurity, issues related to, I assume you're referring to Russian military activities across Europe and out into the Atlantic. So, we've seen a lot of increased Russian military activities, and it's of grave concern to the United States and its European allies. And I think it's all part of, again, this Russian desire, Putin's desire to show that Russia's back as a major power. The real challenge is going to be if there's some kind of any kind of accident would be disastrous. And we saw in the early part after the Russians moved into Syria, before there was this move toward an attempt to jumpstart the diplomatic negotiations, the big concern that Secretary of Defense Carter had was we've got to deconflict and make sure that that the United States and Russian military planes know where each other are, so that we don't have any kind of accident over or around Syria. And with respect to cybersecurity, this is a problem that's only going to increase over time. You've got the challenge on the cybersecurity side is really trying to identify whether you're dealing with organized crime or other criminal networks within a particular country, or whether those networks or those organizations have government support. We face that with respect to both Russia and China, but I think the conflict is only going to grow. That's another area, though. You talk about terrorism as one area where you could have common interests in governments coming together to deal with a common challenge. You should be able to, at least in certain areas, for governments to be able to come together to try to prevent the common challenge that they face in protecting their infrastructure, their businesses, and so on. Thank you, Frank.
We're grateful for a marvelous evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.